Yo, everybody. It's an exclusive nWBro's interview with your host, Karlifornia.
I'm so thrilled to have the one and only Mr. Guy Evans here, the man that wrote Nitro. And now, of course, Beyond Nitro. Guy Evans, how you doing, my friend?
I'm doing great, Carl. It's great to be speaking with you. It's been quite a while, right?
It's been too long. It's been
Six,
too
7
long.
years, I think.
Yes, that's right. And, I appreciate the fact that you were on my old podcast back in the day, the Insider's Edge podcast. But again, been a while since we spoke last. Tell me a little bit, first and foremost, this is something that had taken place after I interviewed you. You did the Who Killed WCW documentary on Vice, and a lot of people were very thrilled that there was like a new kind of a thread out there as it pertains to WCW and what happened to it. How was your experience doing that?
It was a great experience. Thank you for asking. And it was very much unexpected because I think about a year before the show actually aired, I was contacted by Vice. And originally they asked if I would be interested in being interviewed for the show. But in having some initial discussions with them, it became clear to me that, they had essentially use the Nitro book as sort of the basis for how to tell this story. And I think if you look at those 4 episodes that were ultimately produced, you'll see that they very much mirror quite closely the structure and tone of the book. So with that being said, I think based on the positive discussions I had with them and also my recognition of that, we sort of figured out a way for me to get a little bit more involved in the project as opposed to just being interviewed for it. So I was very happy to, sort of be a bit of a consultant for them, looking at some of the draft cuts that were coming out, helping them secure some of the important interviews in the show, which came through my prior connections with some of those people. So I was quite heavily involved in the in a lot of those areas, but still didn't quite know what to expect. I was, very much anticipating a fresh look at the story and was very much impressed just by the aptitude of everyone that was involved, but didn't know what the final visual product was going to look like. And as I mentioned, I was fortunate to see some of those early cuts. And when they started coming in, I was just blown away with the level of care and passion and love that they displayed for the story, and making sure that they did it right this time and didn't fall into some of the pitfalls that the other sort of WCW retrospectives had in the past. And I think, their intentions were very much to give as many different people a voice as possible. That's why you heard from the wrestlers, you heard from some of the executives at Turner Broadcasting, you heard from people who were involved in the WCW sale. And so if you were to compare what ultimately was displayed in that documentary to like a utopian idea of what we would really like to see, right, where there's 300 people being interviewed in a 20-part series, of course you can nitpick and say, well, I would have liked to hear from this person or that person. But I think if you just compare it to what had existed previously, I think they went far above and beyond the other attempts at telling that story. And I think they were very fair with letting different perspectives get their airtime, and leaving some of the more controversial and subjective elements to the story up to the viewer as well. So I was very proud to be involved in that series. I was flattered that they asked me to begin with. I very much appreciated the fact that in all of the publicity for the show, the key people involved at Vice made a point to reference my book and talk about, how important it had been for them in terms of coming up with this idea and how to treat the story. So I've got nothing but good things to say about everyone who is associated with that. And I thought, again, they just did a tremendous job with that 4-part series. My only regret is that I wish it could have been longer. I wish we would have had, 6 or 8 hours to delve into some other areas. But given that we had, 4 parts, I couldn't be happier with how it went.
Yeah, that's cool. I mean, look, you're an author. It must have been a little bit wild for you to see yourself on television, like or on the internet, doing these interviews. you know, as you and I just realized, we're both the same age. Uh,
Mm.
so like if I put myself in your shoes, that would, to me, that would blow my mind. I mean, how did you feel like seeing yourself on a on TV and like they're chiming in with a comment from you, and then it's going to Eric Bischoff, then it's going to this person and that person. I mean, that must have been a bit wild, right?
Well, I think it speaks to when you get involved in a project, the scope of that original book, you never know where it's going to land and who it's going to impact and who it may influence. And that's really the wild and crazy thing about the time that we're living in. The fact that, you know, information is able to be distributed so easily and so swiftly via the internet. You know, that sort of scenario that you just described wouldn't have been possible 20 years ago, because first of
Mm,
all, the Nitro book wouldn't have been published at that particular time. So, um, you know, I continue to be amazed and blown away by how many people that original book reached. And now with this new book, Beyond Nitro, which in many ways truly is going, I would say, far beyond the scope of that original book in a very positive way. And I've been so happy with the great response that we've got to that. You never know who it's going to impact and in
mm,
what way. I mean, there's some people who, you know, read that book and actually really picked up on some of the more human elements, I would say, of the story in terms of the way that some of the key people involved in WCW were described and the impact that the company had on people who worked there. And of course, the closing down of the company, how that affected so many lives and so many families. There was some people that really honed in on that. There were other people that really liked the description of the interplay between Turner Broadcasting and WCW. That's what they got their teeth into. There were other readers who said, wow, the financial stuff and all of the details that you gave there was really up my street. So I was fortunate enough that, you know, that book and now this subsequent book really appealed to people on a number of levels. And all I can do truly in terms of reflecting on the whole thing is thank the readers, because without them spreading the word, I mean, there was zero marketing budget for any of these books. So without the readers talking about it and spreading the word and making other people aware of it, it wouldn't have gone anywhere. So I always thank, you know, the people who agreed to be interviewed in the first place for the book and for the second book. But first and foremost, I have to thank the readers. So everyone listening to this, if you were one of those people, thank you very much.
excellent, bro. Well, yeah, thank you for that insight. And you know, Beyond Nitro is the new book that's
Mhm.
come out now. And you know, did you always know after Nitro came out, did you always know that you had all of this extra stuff to be able to do a second book?
Absolutely. That was always my awareness leading up to the first book, is this could easily be a series, and eventually I had to sort of call it a day. And I thought 600 pages was enough in that particular instance, but I always knew that I had enough to do at least one more book. And of course, you know, we're talking about 7 years ago since that first one was published. So since then, I've been lucky enough to forge even more relationships with a lot of former WCW and Turner people. There's been even more information and data, I suppose you could say, that's been shared with me. And those pre-existing relationships that I had prior to the book have only strengthened, you know, with time, because a number of those people I've known now for essentially a decade, if not a little bit more. And so, yes, I knew that by far I had more than enough for another book, and there were many areas of the WCW story that had yet to have been explored in what I would consider appreciable detail. And I'll give one example of that. You know, we've heard so much conjecture over the years about WCW's financial situation as an entity under Turner.
Mhm.
And we've all read, you know, various accounts of, well, here's what the company made in this particular year, or here's how much they lost in a particular year, without sort of much context or much evidence, you know, surrounding some of those figures. And as a result, there's been a debate that's been forged over time between those people who I think have kind of accepted those figures at face value and used them in their argumentation as to why WCW, you know, succeeded or perhaps failed. And then there's other people who have sort of advised that due to the nature of Turner Broadcasting and specifically the way that its accounting worked, you have to take a lot of those figures with a grain of salt, to say the very least. And you have to understand the underlying mechanism by which these figures were generated. So I've kind of sat back over the last 7 years and looked at that debate playing out, and said to myself, well, I have access, and I might be the only person to have access to all of this information, to actually have, on a line item by line item basis, the financial statements that were generated for WCW under Turner. And I had a lot of that back in 2018, but I've been able to get my hands on even more, since then. So one of the key points of this book, which I think people should know about in terms of how it does go beyond the first book, is I kind of walk you through on a line item by line item basis. Here's how much the company was credited with generating in terms of revenue. Here's how much expense was on the WCW books. And without giving too much away, it really gives you a much deeper appreciation, I think, for why a lot of those people who are actually working inside the company have raised a red flag over some of this conjecture and some of this reporting over the years. So, I'll very quickly wind up the answer by giving you one very specific example, just so you can kind of see where I'm getting at. And I'll actually throw this to you, Carl, because you'll be very adept at answering this, right? So think about the year 1997, right? If I was to ask you about 1997, you've got Nitro beating Raw in the ratings for the entire calendar year, the only time that happened, right? You've got the NWO becoming a cultural phenomenon. You've got the likes of Dennis Rodman getting involved in these massive, mainstream events happening, such as, Bash at the Beach that year with Rodman. Regardless of what we might think of that as wrestling fans, WCW is getting huge mainstream exposure. You've got the Starrcade event at the end of the year with Sting and Hogan. You've got merchandise flying off the shelves. If I was to ask you, to what extent was WCW profitable in the year of 1997, what would you say? I mean, you pick a number if you want, pick a range, but if I was to say, how much money was WCW making in 97, right? What would you say to that?
Well, I mean, to me as a fan, when I look at it, that's the peak. Like, 98 was pretty big too, but that's like they're right there. So I mean, I would imagine that they've made maybe 40 million, but maybe not.
Sorry, mate, I lost you there real quick. Say
Sorry,
that again. I didn't get the end of your answer.
I thought that maybe 40 million. That's just a wild guess.
And I think that's, that's not an entirely unreasonable answer, I suppose, because one of the figures that has been attached to WCW over the years is $55 million in profit in the year 1998, which comes from Eric Bischoff, incidentally. That was his understanding as far as how profitable the company was in 98. So 40 million, I don't think you're sort of, completely off the wall with that estimate. Well, the actual profit that was recorded on the Turner books, okay, for WCW as an entity for the year 1997 was $840,000, 804, less than $1 million. And you might say, how did that happen? All right. And obviously the book goes into a huge amount of detail.
Because is it because Turner's taking most of the profits from the pay-per-views and all that? Like they're taking it and putting it elsewhere?
Here's the distinction that has to be raised as it relates to what an entity was actually generating versus what it was credited for. Those are two very, very different things, right? So as the book goes into in a tremendous amount of detail, and a lot of people listening to this will already have an awareness of this, because WCW was literally listed in a category called Other in terms of the way that the Turner did their books, you have the ability under accounting rules to move around revenues and expenses freely within that category, okay? So that in consolidation, the amounts are reflecting a true picture in terms of the finances. But within that category, there can very easily be discrepancies, it would be a nice way of putting it, relative to what each of those divisions are actually generating, okay? And so if, for example, you were recognizing WCW's pay-per-view revenues at another level of the company, which was happening for quite a period of time, where, for example, in the year 1994, WCW's pay-per-view revenue was going on the books of Turner Home Entertainment as opposed to WCW. You may look at 1994 and say, well, that's not a very impressive financial performance by the company. But when you have the ability to do that, which again is perfectly within accounting rules, and we go into a huge amount of detail about that, it kind of obscures what the true picture was in terms of how successful the wrestling division was under Turner. So I just wanted to bring out that specific example just to let people know where I'm coming from. And I actually go through all of the years during the Nitro era and even before that, and show you here's what was reported, and here are some areas that we might want to be skeptical about. So I think it's safe to say I don't think there's ever been a deep dive like this on any wrestling company's finances. And that is probably the aspect of the book that I think, has excited and interested most people. And I would be in that category as well.
Right, yeah, because like this is what pisses me off the most about wrestling right now. Eric Bischoff has a podcast. He gives an opinion on what he thinks about a company like AEW. And the fans will immediately say something negative like, oh, you ran a wrestling company, you ran two wrestling companies into the ground, blah, blah, blah. Like, hearing what you just said right here, like, it's such a complicated thing back then for WCW that these morons, these mutants, I call them mutants, these wrestling fans from today, they don't even understand what that guy was going through, and it had nothing to do with him. It was already. We're not going to get into it too much, okay? Because I've only got a short amount of time with you. But
well,
honestly,
what I will say very quickly, if I could, I know we don't have all the time in the world, so I'll keep it brief. Is I would just caution against treating something like WCW again under Turner, where it was one of over 150 subsidiary companies, treating it like a lemonade stand, right? So when Carl was 8 years old and he wanted to sell lemonade in front of his house, he could very easily ascertain at the end of the day how profitable that business was. Let's look at what it cost to buy the lemons, and let's look at what we sold them for and how much profit we made. And there's not really a lot of ambiguity when it comes to that, right? To treat something like this in that same manner, which I think often happens, is sort of for lack of a better word, it's sort of I'll just say a misunderstanding of how corporate finance works. But to also do that without any insight or awareness of how these figures were being generated, and without even reviewing the sort of financial records, is puzzling to me. I would never want to sort of definitively make a statement about something like this without actually seeing the data for myself. And I just want to mention, it's not only having access to the data, it's speaking to people who can interpret it as well. Because you look at any organization, and Turner was no exception, there's all kinds of terminology and abbreviations and ways of doing the books that are inherent to that organization. So it's not as if you could just give this data to anyone off the street and they can interpret it. You actually need to pair that with speaking to the people who were there. And that's what the book lays out. And I think it makes a very good case, just looking at it objectively, that, again, you have to take a lot of this stuff certainly with a grain of salt. And that applies to both the years in which WCW was reported as losing money, but also the opposite is true as well. I'll say that.
excellent. And of course, everyone out there, please, in the description, you'll be able to find the links to buying Beyond Nitro and Nitro. I have Nitro. I don't have Beyond Nitro yet. It's my bad. But I will be getting into that. I love that stuff. I love getting into the nitty gritty. But Guy Evans, okay, we're going to move along from here, and I want to go on a journey through time with you. You and I are the same age. I think you probably started watching WCW before I did. Unfortunately, I became a fan in 1998, but I did go back and rewatch things several times over after all these years. But a journey through time. I want to know, Guy Evans, growing up where you grew up, all that way on the other side of the world from where all the action was happening, were you watching Nitro the week, or maybe it was delayed, the week Scott Hall showed up on Nitro? Did you see that?
And I would have to think about that one, to be honest with you. I mean, I got started, uh, the first time I really had an awareness of WCW was when it was on ITV in the early
Mm,
90s, WCW Worldwide. But I
okay.
can't say that I was a fan. I can't say that I followed it religiously. Just, back then, as I'm sure was the case in Australia, there wasn't a lot of programming on TV,
Oh, it's
period,
hard over
right?
here. Yeah, yeah.
And if you didn't have, Americans would call it cable. I suppose the closest analog for us in the UK would be Sky, right? So if you were not a family with Sky Television, which at the time wasn't the case for my family, then you were limited to, man, it would have been 4 channels back then originally until there was another terrestrial TV network, Channel 5, that was added, I think, in '97.
Okay.
So with 4 channels being on TV, whatever was on TV, you're probably going to have some kind of awareness of it. So I do remember that. But it wasn't until later when TNT Europe started showing Nitro and Thunder. That's when I became a regular fan. So yeah, it's a little bit hazy there because we're talking about quite a long time ago, but it would have been the early '90s, and then when the Nitro era kicked in, like a lot of people in the UK, even on our side of the pond, it was something that we all had an awareness of. You could go to school and engage almost anyone,
Mm,
in at least a surface level conversation about wrestling. I mean, the WWF always had much more of a footprint here in the UK, by virtue of the fact that historically, it had been broadcast on Sky. Obviously, we had the legacy of British wrestling here, but in addition to that, there had been a number of landmark events that had happened over here. SummerSlam '92, prominent among them. So
hmm.
so you were much more likely to find WWF fans than WCW fans, but um, particularly once we get into sort of the later part of the decade, like I mentioned, even for us being thousands of miles away, if you were in school at that time, it was something that most people had a pretty decent awareness of.
Right. So when I guess your young fandom was taking place, whenabouts were you finally getting weekly WCW television? Because I mean, it must have been like late 1998 for me. So by that
Yeah.
point, things were starting to slowly but surely not be as they once were. But how about you?
Yeah, I think it must have been '96. I think when TNT over here started showing the programs on a weekly basis. If I remember correctly, I might have to go back and watch it. Um,
Lucky.
yeah, and then we got Thunder when that started, obviously in '98. There was the infamous WCW Worldwide on Channel 5, as I mentioned before. So Channel 5 was the sort of final terrestrial channel that was added during the days of analog TV in '97, and it was sort of this. It was a weird network. It was like a collection of some sports, some sort of American shows, if I remember correctly, some sort of like off the wall programming that you wouldn't see on the other networks. So there was really like no rhyme or reason to what was on at any particular time of day. But in '99, they started showing what they called WCW Worldwide, which was essentially a compilation of matches from Nitro, Thunder, Saturday Night, and
Oh wow.
it was on a delay of several weeks, to be generous. I mean, sometimes it was more than that, and so
Yeah.
it created a lot of sort of infamous moments where things would happen. Like I remember one time where Larry Zabisco was on commentary, and then Larry Zabisco interfered in the match that he was announcing,
Commentate. Really.
right? Because obviously they were sitting down and doing this in a studio, post facto for the international audience. So it was like, if you go back and try to pull up any of that footage on YouTube, you'll see like how zany and how nonsensical that program was, and how Scott Hudson and Larry Zbyszko had to try to make sense of things that was like already 6 weeks old or whatever.
Yeah.
And a lot of times was edited in such a way where like literally one segment of the show, did not relate in any way whatsoever to the next segment. So at that point, a lot more people started watching WCW because that was on a free to air station. But it was kind of unfortunate because it was like the absolute worst way to get interested in the company, because that show was so haphazardly done. But it also coincided, at a time when the company was in free fall anyway. So regardless of how you edited it, it was, you're probably going to get the same impression at that point.
Yeah, I mean, over here in Australia, it's like, when it first like started airing here, it would be like 2 month delay, and
Yeah.
but they'd still air the pay-per-views on time. But
Mhm.
like you'd be so far behind. But anyway, I think people made enough complaints that they finally started fast tracking it to Australia very quickly. But I
Mhm.
wanted to kind of like get some of your thoughts on the NWO, because this is the nWBro's podcast, and I want to know like those early days with the NWO, even if like some of this stuff you had to watch back later on, you know, seeing Scott Hall show up, seeing Nash show up, seeing those first few months of television and how it builds to, Great American Bash with, Bischoff getting power bombed off the stage and all that, leading up to Bash of the Beach 1996. As a fan, like your honest thoughts and feelings towards like how they built that angle up at that point in time.
Well, again, to relate this to the new book, there's a massive two-part section of the book which goes into why the NWO really resonated not only with wrestling fans at that particular time, but beyond the scope of wrestling as well. And I really sort of bring in what I would call some of these external factors or force multipliers that made it bigger than really on the surface it probably even could have been, because it really coincided perfectly with a lot of the sort of social and cultural trends that were happening in the US at that time. So if people really want to hear an extremely deep dive into why I think the NWO became such a phenomenon, they can go and read the book. But I suppose to answer your question, I think the number one thing that I take away from that time, and of course, I've been fortunate to have many, many discussions with a lot of people about this at WCW, including Eric as well, is, to what extent a lot of this was spontaneous, a lot of this was in reaction to what was working at that particular time, how it was dynamic. In other words, they weren't sitting there saying this is the plan for the next 3 months, no matter what. No matter if the crowd is buying this or not, we're going to keep going down this road. It was very much a sort of open, free, creative environment at that particular time, which I think contributed to why the storyline works so well. Now, obviously, the essential component to really put that thing over the top was the involvement of Hulk Hogan,
Mm-hmm.
because if anyone else was to play that role, I mean, if the reveal was to have been Sting, for example,
Oh,
yes, definitely impactful, probably would have extended that thing, I would say a few months, may have taken them to Halloween Havoc or something with a decent amount of
mm,
momentum, but would it have become this legitimate, cultural force for a number of years? Absolutely not. So I think you have to give, all the credit in the world to obviously Nash and Hall for the way that they really set that thing on fire to begin with, and then Hogan to put it over the top, but also all of the creative people involved in terms of being able to be flexible with their approach and to listen to the fans and to do things that were truly revolutionary and groundbreaking at that time. Now, I think as you get into 97 and certainly 98, early part of 99, you can see that they had built this massive dynamic of the NWO versus WCW to such an extent where I truly believe that it was very difficult for them to figure out where do we go next, not only with regard to this story, but also in terms of our overall creative approach, right? So how do we present something that has anywhere near the magnitude of the NWO invading WCW? Maybe you could
mm,
even make the case that at that particular time with that roster and the environment at that time, maybe there actually wasn't a story that could exceed that in terms of overall interest and being innovative and so on and so forth. But I think, you know, clearly they really struggled with pivoting out of that storyline after a period of time. And one of the suggestions that actually made its way into the original Nitro book that I always found very intriguing, and I'd never heard this before talking to him, was DDP. When I spoke to him about this for the first book, and he said, yeah, I actually pitched Eric somewhere around like the early part of '99. Let's actually have the NWO win this battle against WCW. Let's do it conclusively, like at a pay-per-view or something. The NWO is going to take over, not just for like a segment or a show, but they're going to take over. And then what we can do is, after a period of a few weeks or a month or two or whatever, let's do the whole invasion again, but in reverse this time. So let's have WCW, right? Let's have WCW, him and Goldberg and Sting or whoever, Flair. Let's have them invade the NWO show, and we can get a whole other life out of this thing. And I always find that pretty intriguing. And I asked,
it's actually not bad.
Yeah. Well, again, compared to what they were doing, right?
Yeah.
So I asked Eric about this in the new book, and you can read about, you know, what his response is to that, looking back on it. Keep in mind at this time in wrestling, as you know, Carl, you know, the time that we're talking about, it seemed like the shelf life for angles and storylines was much shorter than it is today, where you've seen, you know, it's kind of this contradiction where attention spans have arguably decreased over time. The presentation of wrestling in general has become faster paced in terms of the in-ring action. But equally, we have seen long-running storylines go on much longer than the NWO at this point. You know, in some cases without, you know, a lot of sort of development. So it's interesting to think about, you know, most people, I would say the general audience, were pretty much tired of it by sort of the later part of '98. And in quotation marks, that was only 2 years and some change into the whole you know, storyline.
Yeah.
So maybe in a different era they would have found a way to pivot out of what they were doing and keep it going for a longer period of time. But I'll end with this, and this was another sort of note that I touched on in the book. I think one of the problems ultimately with presenting the NWO in such a way that they did, which was highly successful, is that a lot of fans who were recruited to become interested in WCW came to WCW through the NWO. So to them, the NWO, again, almost paradoxically, was WCW, right? So they weren't watching in the early 90s before it was cool. They weren't watching necessarily in the early days of Nitro. They were brought to the table because of the NWO. So once the company sent the signal that the NWO is not going to be a part of this programming anymore, I think a lot of people, if they weren't already checked out, said, well, this is kind of why I was watching, and now I'm no longer interested in just watching, you know, for lack of a better word, like a typical wrestling company.
Yeah.
So it's a really intriguing thing that we could talk about for years probably, but I think it's, you know, it's difficult to Monday morning quarterback it too much and say, well, they should have done this, they should have done that, because again, although ultimately it probably became so big to the detriment of the company, without the NWO, WCW would never have reached the heights that it did. So you kind of can't have one without the other, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, I agree 100%. Yeah, you know, it's a shame, but like, you know, people go on and on. Oh, the NWO went on forever, and it's like, well, the Bloodline storyline went on forever too,
Right.
even longer. You know, I believe the New Day were like together as a team like twice as long as the NWO were. But anyway, look, we'll get away from like any sort of negativity. I want to ask you some questions about just your favorite things to do, or some of your least favorite things to do with the NWO, as we have about 4 minutes remaining in my recording here. Guy Evans, do you have a favorite NWO moment?
And I mean, I suppose you would just have to go back to the original turn, you know, Hogan at Bash at the Beach. You know, I've talked to so many people about this from so many different angles now. In the new book, Keith Mitchell, who is a legendary producer and director in wrestling, who was involved with world class WCW, TNA, AEW, he talks about that night from the standpoint of being in the truck and just the elation that went down when, you know, Hogan finally pulled the trigger and turned heel, and just the fact that, you know, everyone involved in that production had never seen a visceral reaction like that from the fans. It wasn't a put on manufactured, oh, we're really so mad at Hogan. It was, they did what I think really should be the goal of something like wrestling, which is they were able to generate that suspension of disbelief and have people reacting to what was occurring as if it were real, with no real conscious pretense that, oh, this is just part of the script. So to me, I think, you know, that's a moment that you could go back, and it's one of those sort of ethereal things that you could show to a non-wrestling fan. You know, if they were curious, like, why were you ever interested in wrestling, or what's the appeal of it? You could show them something like that, and they can, again, viscerally pick up on the reaction and the very real emotion that was generated there. And then the promo that Hogan gave, which I think a lot of times gets swept under the rug. You compare that to, like, and again, I never profess to be an avid follower of today's wrestling, because I'm certainly not, but I do obviously track the big things that are going on. And you compare that to, like, the John Cena turn, where, you know, there was a period of time between the turn and then him giving some sort of expository interview as to why he did what he did. They did it overseas. They did it in a very sort of convoluted, drawn out way. Whereas Hogan told you instantly after the fact why he did this, the frustration that he's been, you know, holding for the last couple of years, and did it in a way where it completely made sense. And you even had, you know, Tony Schiavone, for example, saying, you know, maybe this all traces back to 1994. I mean, everyone played their role so perfectly. Gene Okerlund, Hogan, Nash, and Hall, the announcers. People often, and rightfully so, spend a lot of time talking about what WCW didn't do so well, but I don't think you're ever going to see a turn with that kind of magnitude and raw emotion that you saw there. So it may be a cliche answer, but I have to go back to that original turn.
And that's fine. And, you know, the thing that I find the funniest is that Bobby Heenan finally got to say to everyone, see, I told you I was right after all these.
Right. Right, exactly.
So Guy Evans, who was your favorite NWO member of all time?
You know, I was always partial to the phony Sting, Jeff Farmer. That's kind of a
No way.
off the wall answer, but I just found that whole, I mean, it wasn't exactly original per se in wrestling, but I just find that whole presentation to be pretty funny. The idea that this guy, you know, separate and aside from the real person, who was a great guy who I interviewed for the first book, just the way his character was presented as someone who consistently got his ass kicked. He was typically always in the background without a lot of fanfare. I find that very entertaining. I think as a fan back then, you know, Conan was someone that I really liked. Obviously, the Outsiders. I think Hall and Nash. I mean, you know, there's been so many efforts, I think, in wrestling history to sort of manufacture like a cool factor, and by letting these guys, you know, be themselves. I mean, they were the personification of that, each of them. And again, you know, a great entry point for people who are maybe on the periphery who are interested in watching wrestling, right? If you were to watch an interview with a Nash or a Hall or a Conan or someone of that ilk, you know, they talked more like, you know, in a very sort of, you know, for lack of a better phrase, cool way. They talked more like a larger than life person that you would see in other facets of entertainment, not sort of your traditional, you know, wrestling shtick, which I think, you know, sometimes non-wrestling fans have trouble getting into. So I think all of the above, the phony Sting, Conan, the Outsiders. Yeah, I was definitely, as a adolescent back then, definitely a fan of all of them.
Interesting. I'm glad to hear that the NWO Sting getting a little bit of a shout out here.
Of course.
For you, what was the worst moment in the history of the NWO? Don't you dare say the finger poker dome.
Let's see.
I'm an advocate
you
for the
know,
finger poke.
I would just say the fact that it fizzled out. I mean, that's the part that I think,
Mm.
always bothered me, and I think bothered a lot of people is really we're going to build this up as the most important aspect of the show. I mean, let's put to the side. I always have to differentiate when we're talking about this, the television show versus WCW as a business, right? So if we're speaking purely about the actual television program, the fact that you established this massive storyline which overwhelmed everything else on the show, and there was a period of time where everything basically fed into what was going on with the NWO. Every guy who came to the ring and gave a promo had to mention Hogan, had to mention the NWO. The announcers had to talk about it during seemingly every match. The main event every single week was something to do with the NWO. And then the fact that once we get into, sort of the late spring of 99, that it basically just disappears and falls off the map with no rhyme or reason or explanation. Obviously, you have later on like the NWO 2000 under, Vince Russo and Ed Ferrara and so forth. But I think that would certainly have to go down as the worst part of the NWO's run, is the fact that we never got an explanation for why it went away. And I think that's kind of indicative of some of the chaos that was going on with WCW at that time.
Yeah, it was a massive shame that it just fizzled out in '99 because everyone got injured. Uh, Only three more questions here, Guy Evans, before we let you go. Do you have like a favorite like NWO team member or a most underrated NWO member?
Wow, this is definitely a deep cut. Yeah, I think I kind of liked Vincent being in the NWOB team again, because the guy knew how to take a good ass kicking rather. He knew how to take a good ass kicking, and he was I enjoyed the fact there was a lot of unintentional comedy, I feel like, with wrestling back then. The fact that a lot of those guys were used as fodder, to some of the baby faces, and even some of the stuff they did, where they split off with the reformed NWO, and then you still had the B team members, I thought
Mm.
was somewhat entertaining, at least for a period of time. So I'd have to give some love to Vincent on that one.
Excellent. I always loved that period of time when like Steiner, Luger were injured, Nash was injured. I think Hall was in rehab, and just like the NWOB team were like on Thunder and just like taking over the show, and I find that stuff to be quite funny. But anyway, is there somebody that you think should have been in the NWO?
No, I think exactly the opposite. I think there would, and this is
Too
not an
many
original
people.
viewpoint by any stretch, but far too many people ultimately joined the group. I have to say I was not, um, hugely against the idea of having spin-off factions and so forth. Like I know a lot of people, a lot of the former WCW employees will say like, by the time we got to the LWO, I knew that we jumped the shark, because now we're just, watering
I
down the
love the
concept.
LWO. I love them.
Yeah, I was never, again, I look at it differently though, because I was just watching back then. But I actually thought this is kind of a contrarian opinion, but I actually thought in a way that sort of strengthens the impact of the original group, the fact that it has all of these splintering off factions and almost groups made in its own image or inspired by it. So I didn't have too much of a problem with that. I just think that when you add 60 plus people to a core that was so strong at the beginning, quite simply, you're not going to find 60 people with the star power of a Hogan, Hall, Nash, and perhaps a few others. So I did not like, and I may be in the minority here, but I did not like the likes of Sting and Luger joining the Wolfpack. Now I know you can
Oh,
say, well,
okay,
that was a bit,
I
that
get you.
was
Yeah.
that was a babyface faction. It wasn't the same thing. Yeah, but to me, I just think this is where the freewheeling, at times lack of forethought and very open creative process. Uh, that's where we saw the other side of it, right? By the time we get to 98, where in 96 that had worked very effectively. In 98, when they were desperately trying to reassert their dominance in the ratings war, I think it would be fair to say that that was driven by, well, this will be a great way to win the night. This week we'll have Sting
Mm.
join, the Wolfpack, or we'll have Lex join the Wolfpack, as opposed to being something that actually linked in some way to what we had seen before. So yeah, I would have to say with that answer, there's no one that comes to mind. I would say, if anything, they should have drastically cut back on the group.
Fair enough, which leads me to my next question. Which wrestler should have never joined the NWO?
Well, like I say, I would say
You
Lex
have to
and
pick
Sting
one.
as far as the Wolfpack. Man, I think there's so many that, I mean, I always found again, tremendous performer, by all accounts, great person. Um, but like when you have the likes of, Big Bubba Rogers getting
I
involved,
knew
it's
you.
like
I knew it.
it's like okay,
Yeah,
I don't
Big
know. I
Bubba
think
doesn't really suit it, does he? I mean,
yeah, I mean, I even found it made for and this is another thing that I think sometimes gets lost to the passage of time, is this idea that, well, for the first maybe 6 months or so, like everything they did in that storyline was perfect. That's I would, and again, this is subjective, but I would say in my view that's not the case. Even something like Paul White, that original turn, which was made for a hell of a TV moment. I mean,
oh,
I that's
amazing.
one of
Yeah.
that's one of the moments that I will go back and watch, because I love feeling the emotion of that crowd, and the chaos, the absolute chaos that was happening in the ring. I love that ending to the show, and again, one of my favorite moments of the whole era. And as a sidebar, I'm not sure if I ever said this in either of the books, but that moment actually was played to a group of Turner employees on a VHS tape during a sort of discussion about WCW, where at that time there was still a lot of skepticism, obviously, and that never fully went away at all. But it was a lot of skepticism about having the red-headed stepchild of WCW as part of the Turner organization. And there was sort of an advocate for WCW who said, let me show you this. Let me show you, how last night's program ended, essentially. And I remember him saying to me
Yeah.
that was
Wow.
like, people were in amazement about that. So putting that to the side, though, I think you asked the question who shouldn't have joined. That's what I would say. Just despite that being an amazing moment, that represented, I think, an early misstep in my view, where the logic of ex WWF people joining,
Hmm.
you
Hmm.
know, made sense, and now we have a guy who's essentially a homegrown, talent. Now we've changed the original concept, and maybe that was inevitable, but again, if to be ultra critical, I would say that was arguably a misstep, I would say.
I agree, and I know we've gone over time here, Guy. But one thing I will say is that that moment when Giant joined the MWO, I know everything that Eric said. The giant. No, no,
Yeah.
no. Can it be? No, no,
So you've
no.
watched it a fair few times.
So many times, dude. But we're up to Halloween Havoc 1996 right now on the
Mm,
nWBro's podcast, and we found that the Giant is so kind of like lost in the shuffle.
right.
Beforehand, he was doing interviews, every wrestling on the shows every week, Nitro, Saturday night, maybe on the
Hmm.
syndicated shows, but he was on the microphone all the time. Now it's almost like, oh shit, Giants on the microphone. Oh, like he's wrestling at the pay-per-view. Like we hadn't seen him in weeks. It feels
Right.
like he's lost in the shuffle. But anyway, I really appreciate your time here, Guy, and thank you so much for talking to me about what's going on with Beyond Nitro. And again, everybody, please look down in the description. You'll find all of the links to buy Beyond Nitro, and of course, a lot of the other works of Guy Evans with Dave Penzer, and of course, Eric Bischoff. Guy, thank you again so much for your time, and I hope that we can reconvene at some point in the future so I can ask you more questions about how you felt about the NWO's existence.
Absolutely, Carl. I really appreciate the invite. And as always, it's great to speak with you. And hopefully, next time we'll have a little bit more time to get into some more questions. But I just want to wish you, and the whole NWO Bros or NW Bros, I should say,
Yeah.
wish you guys the very best of luck with it. And it's great to see that still so many years later, there's still such an interest in going back and watching and reviewing those old shows. And I'm sure you guys, if you haven't already, I'm sure you're going to find, a great audience. So best of luck with all of that.
Well, thank you very much, Guy, and thank all of you out there for joining me here on the nWBro's podcast with my first ever interview on the podcast here with the one and only Author Extraordinaire, Guy Evans, and we will see you all down the road. Thank you.